Paul Benjamin, representing BloombergNEF. He's a director at BloombergNEF, to talk about the nature-positive transition in food and agriculture. Let's welcome him with a round of applause. We are almost ready, setting up the microphone, and I see we're set. Hello, Paul. Please join me on the stage. And a very good morning to you once again. I hope you're well, because this big stage of ours is all yours now. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. And coming from the UK, this weather is amazing, so I'm really glad to be here. So today, before we dive into the details of technology, I wanted to step back and just give you some context about the transition that food and agriculture finds itself in. We came to this primarily because of the emissions footprint of agriculture, which actually is significant. And you know, the key bits, and it's a complex picture, but the key bits are land use change through deforestation, it's livestock, it's fertilizers, if you needed to take away three things. It's not just about emissions, though. Agriculture has the most impact on the world's kind of nature and biodiversity systems. The really good work around this is being done by Johan Rockström and team, talking about planetary boundaries. And you can see the impact of agriculture on planetary boundaries is much more than any other sector. What makes agriculture really unique in the decarbonization, pantheon is that these two crises, not only does agriculture cause it, but agriculture is the sector that is most affected by these two crises, the nature and climate crises. So, even if we take a long look back at sort of disaster-related agricultural loss, that's been significant. But with what we're seeing with the climate, that what we call climate loss is going to get much worse pretty quickly. So the other thing to note is, the big food companies have come in and launched and committed to net zero targets. Over 2/3 of the largest food companies have announced net zero targets. But if you actually look at the emissions footprint, it is moving the wrong way. I mean, over this 5-year period that I've put here, emissions went up in the top 4,000 listed companies by over 100%. And the money is not flowing. So if we did some scoping on the amount of funding that needs to flow to biodiversity, which you see on the left, it is far below the level that we need, even if we were to meet the sort of 2030 targets. And coming to the venture space, all of you venture capitalists know that this is a tough space. But just looking at the money as a percentage of climate tech venture, it's still very, very small. We hear a lot about collaboration at food and ag conferences, and collaboration is very necessary. But I have started sensing a sort of dark undertone to this collaboration word as code for we don't have a business case. We don't have the enabling conditions to make money flow at scale. So speaking of money flowing at scale, this is what I want to kind of draw some parallels with the energy transition to the extent that we can. Now, this is a transition that has mobilized. Now it's running at close to $2 trillion a year. And so really the question is, what, if any, are the lessons that we can draw from the energy transition? And sort of, I must declare my sort of own bias here, because, we come from a group that is primarily looking at the energy transition. I mean, that's us, that's, 300, 400 people across the world. We started in power, then transport, then materials, and now ag. But the interesting thing here is you can see in the lightly shaded green all the bits of the energy transition that actually link in some way to the agriculture and food transition, be it links through biofuels. I mean, the stuff that we've done in electrification and autonomy is what we talk to the equipment manufacturers about. Carbon is a big topic in food and agriculture. So hydrogen and green ammonia fertilizers. So a whole bunch of links. So I want to look back at the energy transition very, very quickly to just sketch out some outlines of what we could, lessons we could take into food and agriculture. So I actually want to turn the clock back to 2006. This was the 2006 version of the IEA's view on decarbonization. And what you can see behind me is, a bunch of the heavy lifting was to be done by efficiency. There was going to be a lot of CCS. There was going to be a lot of fuel switching. And there was going to be a small chunk of what are called renewables. But there was a whole range of things there, solar, geothermal, bio, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this kind of, so the political orthodoxy at the time was we need an all-of-the-above transition. Now, the thing in talking about all of the above is, at best it sort of dilutes the opportunity set, and at worst, it can preserve incumbency. So this kind of reminds me of what we see in some of the ag landscape today. So this is a huge matrix of solutions to tackle ruminant emissions, both on the supply side, on-herd interventions, on the demand side, and even in sort of crop inputs and fertilizers. There's a bewildering array of sort of chemical alternatives that have to be stacked to get the similar impact as regular chemicals, imposing more complexity and risk on farmers. So how did the energy transition play out? Actually, and this comes to the 80-20 rule, and I wanted to pick up on the 80-20 rule also because of the sort of VC audience here. I mean, all of you run your portfolios according to the power law. 20% of your companies do 80% of the heavy lifting. And so that's really what happened in the energy transition. It was, a small bunch of technologies that really scaled and, brought about most of the impact. Now, just looking at the policy that enabled this, looking at the last 20 years, policy broadly carrots and sticks, right? And actually, the renewable space is completely driven by carrots. Now we're starting to see carbon prices, driving some switching in other areas. But the brilliant thing in Europe, we started renewables with the simplest possible policy of feed-in tariff, i.e., if you put up a solar or wind farm and you just connect to the grid, for every electron that you pump into the grid, you will get a huge premium, and it was fixed for 20 years. So it was simple, it was meaningful, and it did mobilize private capital at scale because, again, to the kind of financially oriented people, so you had a bunch of private equity players come in and do the early sort of renewables build out here in Europe because there was some technology risk. But soon, I mean, the big boys moved in, the utilities moved in, and crucially, they were able to bring in big low-cost capital from the pension funds. So, you as a developer, you develop a wind farm, and then once you've de-risked it, you've got the permitting, you've got the offtake, then you get a huge chunk of low-cost capital in to actually build the thing, right? So it mobilized capital at scale. And actually, after those feed-in tariffs, governments came up with this idea of reverse auctions. Let's auction off capacity and give it to the lowest possible bidder, some value for money for the taxpayer. What was interesting was how quickly this policy mechanism spread across the world. Auctions actually, strangely enough, Brazil was the pioneer of wind auctions. And we saw this rapid adoption of the auction mechanism. So in my mind, I'm thinking, what is the copycat policy? Like, even if one country comes up with an interesting policy, there is a chance for other countries to copycat it pretty quickly. this was coupled with this amazing kind of cost curves on the technology side. So you had policy that was asking people to compete on cost, which drove technology cost adoption. And this is the last 10, 12 years. I mean, the cost reductions are amazing. I will say, I mean, in the early days of the transition, and this would be interesting to think about food and agriculture, the incumbents often miss the early signs of change. And this is, IEA projections on solar capacity in the early days. And you can see how much they underestimated the growth of solar. And I got to tell you, as BNEF, as a renewable specialist, I think almost every solar forecast we've put out has been under what has actually happened. So colleague and I went to COP 16, the biodiversity COP in Montreal, and we walked away thinking, this is a bit of a downer. I mean, people are only talking about problems. We can't do this. We must stop doing this. Where's the opportunity? Where's the stuff that business gets excited about? And I think the key aha moment for me was understanding that it's when solutions become clear and money starts flowing, that's when we harness the power of our capitalist system. So, I mean, there is one other 80-20 I would point out in agriculture, which is, 80% of the damage is done by the 20 least efficient set of producers. And I think this is, often it's smallholder systems, it's farmers that are struggling to subsist that would do deforestation, for instance. This is a government problem. I don't think this moving the bottom 20 is a private sector problem. But just to sketch out, so what I want to do in the next 3.5 minutes is just sketch out the contours of the food and ag system. So one, we have, huge growth in food demand just because of population and wealth growth. The second is we will have, land constraints will continue to increase. I mean, if you just look at the net zero transition, what I have here is, the land required for biofuels and clean power. I mean, that's still much smaller than the land for food and feed. The value chain is complicated. And I'll come to that in a second. So the very quick summary of the sort of trilemma, we love trilemmas coming from energy, is sort of net zero, nature positive, and feed the world's population. But actually food is more complex than that. So the system, very quickly, so we, in terms of the funding that comes into it, about 60% external funding, 40% kind of retained earnings and owner funding. What's really interesting is most of the external funding goes to downstream players. Now, when you talk about profit, it's very skewed. I mean, downstream makes a hell of a lot more profit than the producers. But there is a lot of, so the issue with production is that you have most of the emissions and nature damage happening here, but very little of the value capture. So, subsidies do play a large part for producers, but they're mostly pointing in the wrong direction. So they mostly point in the direction of increased nature damage, increased emissions. So reorienting these subsidies, which is really it's a political problem and it requires some really deft maneuvering. But just sketching that picture out, you can start getting a sense of what are the problems to be solved. So you have all the damage being caused here, very little of the value being captured here. You need carbon and nature attributes to flow through the value chain so you can have preferential, treatment further down. And this is what we spend all of our time thinking about, two dimensions, what technologies and practices, can change this. Who is going to pay for it? How does the system work commercially? In ending, a couple of things to call out. New spray tech is interesting because it aligns sustainability and profitability for the farmer. With green-on-green optical spraying, you can use 95% less pesticide and get the same effects. But your levelized cost, you have to buy some kit, but the levelized cost is still low. Very interesting alignment. increased pressure on downstream players. You can see the majority of their footprint is scope 3. That they are going to put pressure further up the supply chain. And consumers may or may not be willing to pay for more sustainable food, but in the B2B supply chain, there is certainly differentiation emerging on nature and carbon attributes. Biofuels offers a very interesting chance for better policy. Sustainable aviation fuel policy linked to carbon intensity of feedstock. This could really drive sustainability into farming. We may need a hell of a lot more biofuels if nothing else can decarbonize aviation. This is an interesting one. GLP-1s, Ozempic, more people die from obesity than from the pandemic. There is an 80-20 here. The companies that sell high salt, sugar, fat products, 20% of customers buy 80% of that product. And that 20% will be the ones who are getting GLP-1, so there's could be an interesting ripple effect. I thought the energy transition was complex till I started looking at food and ag. So it is complex, I won't deny it, but the size of the prize is significant. It's not just climate and nature, it's health, it's food security, it's farmer incomes. And so I would say because of the complexity and the constraints, I think there is even more of a need to focus on the 80-20. And that's, so that's a picture from 2 weeks ago, or a couple of weeks ago in Brazil. It's clear that, we can't really wait. Extreme weather is all over the place. Thank you. I'm out of time. Have a great conference.
Thank you very much, Paul. Before you go, just a quick question. It's fair to ask after the first speaker is done with the opening speech, inspiring one. Thank you, lots of interesting inputs. If we were to be in wishful thinking territory about the industry, and if your one wish were to be fulfilled, what would you like it to be?
It's clearly policy. Policy pointing in the right direction to enable, to basically make solutions commercial.
Thank you very much.